We know MLK, we know Malcolm X, we know Rosa Parks, and we know the iconic Shirley Chisholm. But who are some of the unsung black heroes that we know nothing about? Well, join me this Black History Month as we walk through 28 days learning about 28 who should be iconic but are unsung black heroes. Hello, everyone. I'm Quentin Jiles, your host from The Q with Q, and welcome to another episode of Unsung Black Heroes. Every day this month, I'm going to introduce heroes who have influenced not only the African American community, but the world at large. And today, we will be covering the life and the impact of Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Townsend was born October 6, 1917 in Montgomery County, Mississippi. She was the 20th and the last child of sharecroppers Luella and James Townsend. She was the what? She grew up in poverty, and at the age of 6, she joined her family picking cotton. By the time she was 12, she left school to work in the fields. Growing up, Hamer witnessed her mother's courage to walk around with a concealed pistol to protect her children from landowners who were known to beat black sharecroppers' children. Also, her mother instilled in her a sense of pride in being black when Hamer didn't see it as a benefit as a child, an attribute that would help her become a powerful orator in the future. In 1944, she married Perry Hamer, and the couple toiled on the Mississippi plantation owned by B.D. Marlowe until 1962. She was the only worker that could read or write, and she served as the plantation's timekeeper. Now in 1961, at 44 years old, Fannie Lou Hamer got a hysterectomy by a white doctor without her consent. Sound like the same thing they were doing to migrant people on the border just a few years ago. While she was undergoing surgery to remove a uterine tumor. This forced sterilization of black women was used to reduce the black population. It was so widespread that it was dubbed the Mississippi appendectomy. The history of black people being mistreated and abused by the medical professional is long and tragic. And y'all wondering why black folks is like, no man, pay them to this coronavirus vaccine. Unable to bear children of their own, the Hamers adopted 2 daughters. After attending a meeting led by James Foreman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and James Bevel of the Southern Christian Leadership Committee, SCLC, Hamer was furious by the efforts to deny blacks the right to vote. This was in 1961, 4 years before the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that enforced the right to vote for black people. So what did Hamer do about it? After the meeting, she became an SNCC organizer, and on August 31st, 1962, she led 17 volunteers to register to vote at the Indianola, Mississippi courthouse. Now, they were denied the right to vote due to an unfair literacy test. On their way home, the group of volunteers was harassed, and the police stopped their bus and gave them a $100 fine for the made-up charge that the bus was too yellow. The bus was too yellow? Unfortunately, that night, Marlowe fired Hamer for trying to register to vote. Her husband was required to stay until the harvest. The Hamers moved to Ruleville, Mississippi in Sunflower County with very little. In June 1963, after Fannie Lou Hamer successfully registered to vote, she and several other black women were arrested for sitting in a white-only bus station restaurant in Charleston, South Carolina. At the jailhouse, they were brutally beaten. And I'll spare the horrific details, but the beating left Hamer with lifelong injuries from a blood clot in her eye, kidney damage, and leg damage. After the beating, she was eventually released. This is really just one of the reasons why the right to vote is so important to people, and specifically black people. So many unsung heroes that were maimed and murdered for the privilege that we have today, we so easily let go of. Let's not think about what we would have done back then, but let's think about what we can do now. Your vote counts. If it didn't, people wouldn't have had to suffer the way they did to get it for us. People in Congress wouldn't be working so hard to restrict the right to vote. The right to vote was earned by black people, and we owe it to the Fannie Lou Hamers of the world, those who stood against the injustices, those who gave it all so we could have the right to vote. Okay, let me back down because I'm about to get heated. So back to Fannie Lou Hamer. Our good sis wasn't done yet. It took Hamer more than a month to recover from her injuries from that assault. Though she was left with profound physical and psychological effects, she returned to Mississippi to organize voter drives, including the 1963 Freedom Ballot, which was a mock election. She became known as a motherly figure who believed that the civil rights effort should be multiracial in nature. She also played host to Tuskegee University student activists Sammy Young Jr. and Wendell Paris. Young and Paris grew into profound activists and organizers under Hamer's tutelage. Sadly, Young was murdered in 1966 at a gas station in Macomb County for using a white-only restroom. In 1964, Hamer's reputation soared as she co-founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, which challenged the local Democratic Party's efforts to block the black vote. Ooh, child, yes, you must do the research on the Democratic Party. They wasn't always allies, if you will. Child, and the Republican Party. Let's get back to it. Hamer and the other members of the MFDP went to the Democratic National Convention that year, arguing to be recognized as an official delegate. Hamer's televised testimony was interrupted because of a scheduled speech by President Lyndon B. Johnson. But most news networks broadcast her testimony later that evening to the nation, giving Hamer and the MFDP much exposure. Senator Herbert Humphrey tried to propose a compromise that would give the Freedom Democratic Party 2 seats. The MFDP rejected the compromise, with Hamer saying, quote, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats when all of us is tired," end quote. And I ain't mad at the Ebonics, sis. Hamer fought for the equality in all aspects of life. Frustrated with the political process, Hamer turned to economics as a strategy for greater racial equity. In 1968, she started the Pig Bank to provide free pigs to black farmers to breed, raise, and slaughter. I do love a good piece of bacon. A year after that, she launched the Freedom Farm Cooperative, FFC, buying up land that black people could own and farm collectively. She had assistance from donors, including the famed singer Harry Belafonte. She purchased 640 acres of land and launched a co-op store, boutique, and sewing enterprise. She single-handedly ensured that 200 units of low-income housing were built. Many still exist in Ruralville today. During this time, Hamer was a traveling speaker. She spoke at various colleges, universities, and institutions. She became a respected speaker after being ridiculed. If you remember, she left school in the 6th grade to work with her family. But during her time as the plantation timekeeper, she worked on speaking to both white and black people. Despite her lack of education, she was still able to move people with her words. Hamer's style of speaking and connecting to the audience stemmed from the fact that her family belonged to a Baptist church while she was growing up. Hamer wove a deep love of confidence, biblical knowledge, and even comedy into her speeches. Many didn't think her speeches were possible for someone without a formal education. Things y'all gonna learn to do? Stop doubting black women. People were also impressed that her powerful speeches were never written. All of her speeches were from memory. Hamer had supporters like Ella Baker, Bob Moses, Charles McLaurin, and even Malcolm X. She was known to invoke strong emotions in listeners in her speeches and in her telling it like it is oratorical style. I can relate. One of Fannie Lou Hamer's most famous speeches was at Williams Institutional Church in Harlem on December 20th, 1964, along with Malcolm X. In her speech, Sick and Tired of Being Sick and Tired, she chronicled the violence and injustice she experienced while trying to register to vote. While she talked about the various acts of brutality she experienced in the South, she also tied in the fact blacks in the North and all over the country were suffering the same oppression. In 1968, the MFDP was finally seated at the Democratic Party, adopting a clause that demanded equality of representation from their state's delegation. In 1971, she helped found the National Women's Political Caucus. In 1972, Hamer was elected as a National Party delegate. Listen, Fannie Lou Hamer's impact is felt every time a minority gets to vote, whether we realize it or not. She was an organizer in Mississippi, of all places, that played a pivotal and important role in the civil rights movement. Often, the men of the civil rights movement overshadowed the women, who were working just as hard. Her legacy is one of equality for Black people. When she passed away from breast cancer and hypertension on March 14, 1977, over 1,500 people were in attendance. Andrew Young, United States Ambassador to the United Nations, spoke at the service saying, quote, "None of us would be where we are now had she not been there," end quote. Stay tuned for more Unsung Black Heroes. Give this video a thumbs up if you learned something. Please subscribe to my channel and hit the bell notification button to always be first in the queue. Women who were working just as hard. I don't know what I want to do with that. You can keep it or cut it out. I don't know. It doesn't matter. And Weldon Wendell in Indianola, at the Indianola, Mississippi. Yeah, Mississippi, right? Yeah. In June 16. Right, Fannie Lou Hamer. All right. Hamer was furious. Uh-oh. Dancing and emphasizing. I'm dancing and emphasizing. That was a good one. Come on, Fannie Lou.